Well, for more on the elections in the Central African Republic, I'm now joined via Zoom from New York by Central Africa Director, Human Rights Watch, Mudge. Thanks so much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
I suppose that, 800 polling stations out of 5,000 shut because of rebel activity is an indicator of just how dangerous and precarious the situation is in large parts of the Central African Republic.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's 800 out of 5,000 that we know about now. I expect that number actually could go up. The fact is that roughly 80% of the Central African Republic is under some degree of control by armed groups not aligned with the national government. So I think the fact that we have such a large number of polling stations that we're not allowed to vote really does put into question how free and fair this election will emerge to be.
We've seen Rwandan troops, Russian troops, French planes flying over, again to try and shore up the authorities' bid to have these elections happen. I can only guess that it must be exceptionally difficult for a large number of citizens living on the ground.
Yeah, you talked about the international forces, and what's more, as alluded to in your report, over 12,000 international peacekeepers aligned with the UN, and yet stability has been so difficult. When we talk about the Central African Republic, in many ways we're talking about the Republic of Bongi, the capital. The capital remains very much under control, or at least under a semblance of control. But anything outside of it is really sort of up for grabs to these armed groups. And, to your question with regards to the citizens, this has been 7 years now of protracted crisis in the CAR, although it's a country that has not seen stability for generations. And they are the ones that bear the brunt. They are the ones that suffer the consequences. The political elites, the presidential candidates, they're not going to suffer with this latest bout of violence. Who's going to suffer are the average Central African citizens, many of whom are just trying to go about and live a semblance of a daily life under this crisis.
What kind of things do they have to manage? I mean, are they caught up in conflict in terms of fire between rebels and authorities? What's happening? I mean, are these rebels attacking villages in remote areas? What is happening on the ground?
Sure. The Central African Republic, as your report again alluded to, it's a huge country. It's about the size of France, but it's very sparsely populated, only about 4.5 to 5 million people. So it's not a lot of people in a large landmass. When the rebels attack, what happens usually is that there's some degree of civilians killed. And these rebels are either anti-Balaka militias or folks tied to the anti-Balaka militias, or folks tied to the former Seleka alliance that took power in 2013. So there's some civilians killed, but the biggest problem is the displacement. You see tens of thousands, just this last week, with this latest bout of violence, we've seen tens of thousands, up to 60,000 civilians kicked out of their homes. They flee into the bush. And when that happens, they're susceptible to malaria. They're susceptible to waterborne diseases. You have women dying in childbirth. You have all these other factors that come into play with tens and tens of thousands of people who are living outside, living rough, and living in the bush. So, they take control of a town, but it's a town without any citizens. It's a town without any people. The people are outside. And while you may have only had 10, 12, 15 people killed in that attack, you might have 200 or 300 killed in the subsequent months afterwards. These are folks who die of preventable diseases. And that's the real tragedy of this cyclical violence in the Central African Republic, is that the citizens who are there, they know the script, they've been through it before, they pack up their belongings very quickly, they flee into the bush, and once they're in the bush, they're completely cut off and they're living completely on their own with no support.
We know that they didn't want this election to happen, these rebel groups. In fact, organizing themselves, we believe, into a coalition. How much do we know about these rebel groups? Who are they and what do they want?
So this coalition is called the CPC, the Central African sort of Patriotic Coalition, which is the rough translation from from French into English. This is a rebel group made up of really some of the most notorious groups that have operated on the ground since 2013. The 6 groups that make up the coalition, I'll spare you the details of the minutiae of every group. But what I can say is this, is that these groups have been tied to the deliberate targeting of civilians. They've been tied to using rape as a weapon of war. They've been tied to pillaging and looting on a mass scale. These are groups that were both Seleka and anti-Balaka groups. These are groups that were tied to former President François Bozizé, former Seleka leader Michel Tchodia, who was the leader of the Seleka, who was an interim president. And these are groups with a vast degree of blood on their hands. They have realized over the last 7 years that the more blood they spill, the more carnage they are seen to commit, the greater their chances are at the bargaining table. And that's, again, another tragedy of what's happening, is that to date, none of these leaders of these groups have been actually held accountable. But I will add, on the degree of optimism, the leader of one of these anti-Balaka groups, a fellow by the name of Patrice Edouard Ngaisona, he's actually in The Hague at the ICC. And moreover, there's a hybrid court, a tribunal in the Central African Republic made up of both national and international judges and prosecutors, which has been charged with trying the most serious crimes in the CAR. So while impunity continues to drive, in our opinion, Human Rights Watch, this crisis, there is some degree of optimism on the horizon. So we do hope that once these folks are actually held accountable for their actions, that might serve as a warning for future rebel leaders that they should be careful as to what crimes they commit.
Is there any influence by neighboring countries? I mean, they're surrounded by a number of countries who themselves have not enjoyed too much stability. Cameroon, South Sudan, Chad, even DRC. Is there any play into Central African Republic from these neighboring states?
I think you've hit on a really important point. It's to note that the Central African Republic is in many ways a crossroads of conflict on the continent. And you know, a South African audience will know this too well. I mean, South African forces were lost in 2013 in the Battle of Bangui. So this is something that should resonate, at least with some of the folks who are listening in ZA. You know, as you just alluded to, there's a lot of arms. Sudan, South Sudan, there's a lot of arms. There's a lot of rebel militia groups flowing through the area. Joseph Kone's group, you know, is rumored. The Lord's Resistance Army is rumored to be sort of scattered about in the northeast. And so, you know, this is always going to be an unstable region. I think what's most concerning about this bout of violence is that it's happening in the West. And the reason why that's important is because the vast majority of Central Africans live in the west of the country. So Bangui, go north and move west. And that's where the vast majority of this population is. And what's concerning is we've seen this rebel coalition, the CPC, take territory very, very quickly over the last couple of weeks. They've taken towns, they've controlled roads, they've pushed international forces out or into their barracks in very strategic towns in the West. And so it does lend a new dynamic to this crisis, and frankly, one that I think folks, you know, should be taking very seriously. While the vote has come and passed, and while I expect we'll have either a victor or we will move into a runoff election, the political process in of itself should not be interpreted as stability, because we are looking at a very unstable situation for the weeks and months to come.
All right, Lewis Mudge, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much indeed for your valuable insights in the situation in the Central African Republic.